Okay, I see people coming in and lots of greetings being exchanged. So welcome everybody to this afternoon's event, the book launch for The Architecture of Point William, a Laboratory of Living. And this book right here. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Elsa Lamb. I'm the editor of Canadian Architect magazine, and I'll be your moderator for the event this afternoon. We've assembled a remarkable group of panelists to share their thoughts and to share about their participation on this special project. And I'm going to introduce the panelists, though honestly, this is one of those panels where no introductions are really needed, I think, for this remarkable group. First, Ed Burtynsky is an acclaimed photographer who is known globally for his remarkable large format photographs of landscapes around the world. His work in film creates powerful immersive experiences. You would probably know the films Manufactured Landscapes, Watermark, and most recently Anthropocene, The Human Epoch. Ed Burtynsky participated in this book by photographing the first structure on Point William, the Point William boathouse, 21 years ago for Architect magazine, back when he was starting out as an architectural photographer at that time. And then at Brigitte and Howard's invitation, he revisited the site 21 years later to photograph it again. Next in our panel is Professor Ken Frampton, the Ware Professor at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University. He's published many seminal books that have been instrumental in shaping our modern discourse on architecture and tectonics, including most recently an update to Modern Architecture Critical History that takes a global perspective on the modern architecture and its around the world. His most recent accolades include the 2018 Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement from the Venice Biennale of Architecture. And Ken visited Point William under construction and again upon its completion a few years later. And his sketches and text about that visit are part of this book as well. Next is Scott Norsworthy, who is a talented architectural photographer based in Toronto. He has an undergraduate architecture degree from McGill University and a graduate degree from the Daniels faculty. He's a registered architect who has chosen to focus his creative energies on the art of architectural photography. He's photographed several Shim-Sutcliffe projects, including Point William. And last but not least, Brigitte Shim and Howard Sutcliffe, who are partners in the firm Shim-Sutcliffe Architects. The delight in working at all scales, from the landscape to the architecture, and then of course to the furnishings, the fixtures and the fittings for their buildings. Their work at Point William has been a kind of laboratory of experimentation and innovation, and that's the title of this book, A Laboratory for Living. To date, Shim-Sutcliffe has received 15 Governor General's Awards for Architecture and an American Institute of Architects National Honor Award for their built work. Brigitte Shim is also a professor at the Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto. So now I'll turn it over to Professor Mason White, who is the Director of Events at the Daniels faculty, to share our land acknowledgement. Mason will also be monitoring the chat for questions at the end of this session. So if you have some questions as the presentation proceeds, then please put them in the chat and we'll keep an eye out for them. Thank you, Mason, for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Elsa, and congrats to everyone on the book. Very much looking forward to the discussion today. First, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto is located. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant and wampum between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Three Fires Confederacy, and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources in and around the Great Lakes. Today, the digital space and conceptual place that we are meeting in, as well as the meeting place of Toronto, are still the home of many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. While we recognize that not everyone is sharing the same space during this time, we encourage each of you to take the time to think about, learn, and reflect upon where you are and the Indigenous peoples who have lived there, are currently there, and the future generations who will live there. As people living on this land, it's essential for us to reflect on the ethos and respect that the Indigenous communities show towards the land and towards each other. We must show support through our actions, not just our words, for those of us who are occupying the land. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mason. And now I'm going to turn it over to Brigitte and Howard to give us a preview of what's inside this book and a bit of the story of how it came together.
Great. Thank you so much, Elsa, and thank you so much for the participants for hopefully a great discussion. This book really tries to capture the evolution of a site over 2 decades. And it really recalibrates both the architecture and the landscape to reimagine a place in the Canadian landscape. This is the cover of the book, and we were very fortunate to work with a graphic designer and architect named Anita Matusevics, who helped us realize this book. Kenneth Frampton provided really insightful introduction with selected images, as well as his own sketches, which really frames a way of seeing Point William for the reader. If we go to the next slide, in this image, you're actually seeing, in effect, a few selected photographs, and that in the upper right-hand corner, you're actually seeing some of Kenneth's sketches. He's actually describing the cinematic quality of the space, and with his sketches are some of Scott Norsworthy's photographs of this entry space. And Kenneth describes through the sketches these deep weathering steel fins that straddle inside and outside. So this kind of idea that, you know, Kenneth is really a kind of important theorist and historian, but he also was trained as an architect. And so the architect in him had to really understand these spaces by drawing. And we felt it was really great to share that. I would say the other text in the book is by Michael Webb, who is a very gifted writer and an advocate for architecture and the arts. And Michael's interview with Howard and I describes our evolving vision for Point William. And so he makes a very important contribution to the book as well. If we go to the next slide, this is one of Ed Burtynsky's shots, as you can tell. And he was really asked to revisit the site 2 decades later after his first visit. And so this is a very dramatic drone shot that really captures both the built form, but also this sense of place on the Canadian Shield. We go to the next slide. In this image, you're also really seeing this kind of breathtaking view of the main building situated at the point itself. And you're really linking the building with the rock, the water, the forest as a kind of cohesive designed entity. Next slide. Throughout the book, we really pair photographs with sketches and drawings that really share the delight and the love of craft in architecture. Point William has really been truly a laboratory for living, enabling us to experiment at so many different scales over this 2-decade period of time, which is really unusual and very exceptional. Next slide, please. So we are now in February, and we all know how important the season of winter is to the Canadian psyche. And in this book, we really tried to capture not just the verdant green summer landscape, but also winter is very present. And in a way, this is one of Scott Norsworthy's photographs, and we're also so privileged to work with 3 generations of photographers on this book. The one who isn't here is James Dow, who we've actually worked with for the last 3 decades. And his photos from the boathouse to all of the buildings at Point William is also very present in the book. And what an amazing privilege to have so many brilliant photographers contributing their different visions of this project over this 2-decade period. So our work at Point William really fuses together both the site with wood, water, and rock. And they're really reconsidered both in their raw form and then also reinvented into built form. And this kind of play between a kind of nature culture conversation, the found condition of the landscape, and then the rethought condition through architecture is something that I think you'll see throughout the entire publication. The next slide. Albert Alto considered the door handle the handshake of a building. And we've been really fortunate at Point William to be able to design not only custom hardware, but lighting, fireplace tools, boat cleats, all kinds of fittings and fixtures. And within the 4 buildings of Point William, we were really able to experiment at so many scales. So the subtitle, A Laboratory for Living, is really a kind of just a whole series of ongoing explorations. So this image shows on the left-hand side, hand sketches of a custom door handle. And then on the right-hand side shows a view at the front entry. So as you go through the book, you'll just be always seeing, in effect, process, models, sketches with the finished photographs. And I think that for us, this kind of interest in process is ongoing in all of the different publications that we've done. And we continue that preoccupation in this Point William book. Next slide. So really the reinvention of Point William is a story about how built form and landscape contribute to making a place in the Canadian landscape. As architects, we know that time is such a powerful force, enabling us to reflect and shape space. And maybe at Point William, the buildings that we erased and the things that we revealed were maybe more powerful than the architectural forms themselves. As architects, we also know that you can't do good work without exceptional clients. And Howard and I have been so fortunate to work for 2 decades with Jerry Sheff and Shanitha Katchen, remarkable clients who believe that design matters. So from the very first project, the Boathouse, their aspirations, their commitment, their patience, and a set of aligned values really established the kind of work that we were able to do. And it continued through all 4 projects and all of the landscape. And the pleasure of construction, with all of its facets, its complexities, its challenges, were embraced by both the client and the architect. So you have this amazing kind of exceptional possibility of working together over 20 years to realize something. Last slide. And then we're really, as architects, at the end of the book, we've included floor plans, reflected ceiling plans, selected sections. We also know that none of the work at Point William would be possible without a remarkable group of highly skilled and talented builders, craftsmen, tradespeople, and the results are credited to all of their considerable efforts, like the final results. And I just want to make sure we thank Wayne Judges and Tom Montgomery of Judges Contracting for leading, in effect, the construction of all 4 buildings and the landscape over this extended time period. And we've taken a lot of care to make sure that we've credited every single person that we could think of that had worked on the realization of the building itself. And we really owe them a huge debt and our appreciation. So turn it over to Elsa.
Great. I'll kind of launch off the discussion among all of the panelists. Maybe we can start with you, Ed, since your photos of the boathouse are one of the kind of, I guess, the oldest objects in the book in a way, along with the boathouse itself, of course. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the experience of photographing the boathouse 20 odd years back, and then revisiting the site and coming back to, of course, a much different site very recently to rephotograph the ensemble of completed projects at Point William.
Thanks, Elsa, and great to be here, and great to be with you, Brigitte and Howard, and revisiting the project yet again. It was always so much, and actually that photograph with, that's Howard in the canoe paddling. And it's actually the moment where I actually got to meet Howard and Brigitte and Jerry and Sunitha. And it was a real privilege to do that project. And back then I was working with a large format 4x5 camera. That was my tool of choice. And I was doing a lot of work with industrial architecture, but an industry itself. And I was also always interested in photographing architecture. It's the same kind of methodic tool that you approach a subject with in a kind of slow and conscious way to kind of frame it up. In fact, you can see here, I've lined up the boathouse with the horizon to kind of create this kind of shape to that the canoe is actually heading into, that I thought was a really beautiful visual connection with the architecture and the landscape. And it was also the beginning of a long friendship with Howard and Brigitte, and that continues to today. And it all began there with the project with Architectural Digest. And I hadn't worked with them before, and they just called me up and said, would you like to do this? And I remember going there, and I was at that time shooting with a 4x5 camera, and I was using Type 55 Polaroid back when you can get that, and it gave you a negative, and you can check your focus, your composition, your exposure, all of those things to make sure that you've got what you want before you commit to the color film. And I really enjoyed working with that technology at that time with the best films that I could find. And I remember walking through the boathouse, and the thing that I came to mind was I was walking through a finely crafted piece of furniture, but it was the whole thing. Everything was so beautifully appointed. All the colors, the textures, the lines, everything had worked together. So it was a real joy to put my camera to that building. And then going back over 20 years later, and I was asked to see if I would be interested in continuing the exploration, and I was happy to. But now I come back to it 20 years later, and I've evolved to a whole new way of working. So I've been using a lot of aerial photography, a lot of drone work, and also, really thinking with digital. And I didn't need to proof with a Type 55 film anymore, that the proof was already there on the back of the camera while I'm shooting. And even in a situation like this, I was able to, with drone, to have an image back on land where I'm shooting, to be able to actually compose, make sure that everything was as I wanted, and was able to photograph with a large format Hasselblad at a distance, and be able to kind of control all of those functions, from exposure to sharpness and depth of field, from the air and from a drone. And I've been working with a drone now for over a decade with a Hasselblad, and even with motion picture cameras on the drone as well. So it was great to come back with new tools, to be able to see it in ways that were really not available when I was doing the boathouse. So it's really something that I took great pleasure in being able to, again, give it the context for the building, to show it in a way that was literally impossible unless you hired a helicopter and at great expense to do it, even back then. So now you can do it with these new phenomenal tools. So it was a real, again, privilege to see the whole project in fruition, and again, the dedication to craft and materials and just space that I think that the project just exudes. So it was, again, a real treat to go in all the different seasons to see it and see how it responds to the landscape as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing with us, Ed. Ken, maybe we can turn it over to you to talk about your contribution to the project. And I understand that you visited it, and you Howard and Brigitte to not give you a tour because you preferred to sketch the site and to develop a certain understanding of it on your own. I'm wondering about this process of how you compose the text and research the site.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking quite a lot about this also for this occasion, but I constantly come back to the same thing when I was thinking just this minute before speaking, that on the one hand, of course, as in other architectures, in other buildings, there is a kind of image, there is a kind of understanding of the whole. And I think Ed Burtynsky's drone photographs of the main house, for example, convey that in an absolutely exceptional way. And also, one might add, of course, it's the way mostly people don't see it. It's interesting that because the aerial photograph creates a kind of overall image of the main house, which in fact, most of the time, one does not see, and so it kind of conveys the idea, the comprehensive idea of the building. And, but of course I'm not a photographer, and I didn't have those kinds of vantage points to look at things from. But apart from all of that, I think one of the interesting things about Shim-Sutcliffe's work is the fact that although the building can be understood as an image, as a composition, if you like, in the old-fashioned sense, actually the characteristic of the work, which is all pervasive, is that it is constructed, that it is built, that it is a built tactile assembly of components. And that makes, makes one's kind of, well, for someone like myself, for example, it makes it quite a challenge to comprehend exactly what it is, I mean, I love the remark of Walter Benjamin that architecture is mostly appreciated in a state of distraction. And I think even for specialists, there's a slight tendency to become distracted. But if these buildings, and particularly the Point William assembly of buildings, also as a kind of conceptual sequence in relation to the architect's own development, but also in relation to the unfolding understanding of the site, means that there's something very elusive about the buildings in a way. I mean, one really has to work at it. That's the feeling I had, and this is the reason why I sort of turned down the generous offer of a tour and went out to my kind of idiosyncratic self and with a sketchbook and started to draw, the way these buildings touch the earth in particular, but also the textures of the earth and of the rocks and of the gravel, which the architects brought to the site. Also this almost fetishistic, I would say, preoccupation with stacked wood, almost as a kind of metaphor in a way for Canadian history in some sense. So that many of these buildings are partly clad, aspects of them, in stacked wood. And it's very unique, I think. I don't know of any other building where this is so evidently the case. And of course, it's used here almost symphonically. I mean, it appears, to make the musical analogy, through, as one makes one way through the site, in one building after another. Well, the main house is sort of mainly free of it. All the other buildings, well, actually, it's interesting. Both the first building and the last building are sort of relatively free of it, but the buildings in between, the guest house, the garage, etc., the actual point of arrival, this stacked wood is the theme which constantly runs through all of them. So it's things like this, the way in which the buildings come down to the ground, the character of the ground itself, the movement of the ground in relation to, like here, for example, this classic, really extraordinary rock that clearly unmovable, and obviously a decision was made not even to try to move it, or as it were, partly deconstructed. I mean, it is what it is, and it is an inherent part of the site. And I think that quality of the ground, of the landscape, of the earth, is absolutely crucial to understanding what has been achieved here. I sometimes think that it is a kind of, however unconsciously, a kind of stroll garden. I mean, one can't really be in the site without moving around it. Also in relation to the lake. And in that sense, it's also quite infinite in a way. I think it's somehow inexhaustible because one's own movement in the space in relation to the buildings and their reciprocity in relation to each other are constantly changing and constantly different, and one can't really come to an end with one's experience of the place. So that's the main motive behind all of my sketches, which I've never had this experience before. Perhaps, well, I have approached buildings from a point of view of drawing them to try to understand them. And in some ways, of course, I think as opposed to photography, and this is sort of something which is very much out of date, but in a way one fully understands the building perhaps only by drawing it, as a matter of fact. That you really fully understand how the parts of a building go together, because you in order to represent them on a page, you're forced to understand exactly how they go together in order to draw them in. And this is particularly true of buildings which have very complex kind of tectonic structural nature, and where there's a sort of multitude of metaphorical references from one part to the next and so on, which is of course already very true in the boathouse, but which persists throughout the work. So that's my main, this is what I would have to say about this. And I can't thank the architects. I'm very, I don't know, I'm kind of honored at the fact that these weird sketches appear in this book. And yeah, I mean, it's the first time in my life and perhaps the last also, but in any case, it has been a pleasure to work on this publication, to participate in the finalization of this extraordinary 20-year adventure. Thank you.
I want to circle back to some of your remarks, Ken, but first I'd like to bring Scott into the conversation as well. And Scott, you were invited to visit the site several times in order to photograph Point William in many different seasons and to understand its changes throughout the year. I'm wondering what you noticed about the architecture of Point William in relation to these seasonal changes, and how you're seeking to convey those observations in your photographs.
Right. Thanks, Elsa. I think I was so lucky to have the chance to visit the site several times over the course of 2 to 3 years. But before that, even shortly after I finished my schooling at the University of Toronto, where Brigitte was a professor of mine, she asked me to photograph some of the pieces of hardware, some still in their kind of prototype phase. And then to see those pieces installed in situ 3 or 4 years later was actually a really interesting kind of shift and way of understanding the scale at which they work and the level of detail and consideration in the project. But when it comes to the seasons, I think that it really enabled me to capture a range of photos that we knew would only be possible to make at a certain time of the year. I think the winter shots are obviously the most kind of obvious example. In the winter, the place has this incredible quietness, this kind of stillness about it, which I hope comes across in some of the shots, particularly the ones that were shown earlier from the lake, looking back towards the boathouse, where this kind of tiny jewel of an object is shown in contrast to this vast frozen lake under these towering white pine trees. But then on the interior, I think there's kind of a different element, and that for me really comes down to the quality of light that changes throughout the course of the year. Not just the quality, but also the direction and the intensity of the light. And as a photographer, I usually plan how to approach a building over the course of a day, depending on the weather and the arc of the sun across the sky. But it was interesting in this case to be able to expand that process of thinking across the span of the year, where we can also take into account the changing seasons and all of the varied differences that would bring to the qualities of light inside this complex building with many kinds of apertures and skylights facing different directions. Brigitte and Howard, we spoke quite a bit about that sequence of shots along the main corridor at the entry of the main cottage, and as a really important part of the project, and one that you described so eloquently, Kenneth, in your piece. But because of the topography of the site and the orientation of the main axis of the building, we found that those shots to get natural light flowing in were only really possible at 5 in the morning in the middle of the summer near the solstice. And so there was deliberate planning that went into achieving some of those images that really wouldn't be possible at other times of the year. But even though, and I think this is kind of an interesting comparison to look at these two shots at the same time, because in some ways, a lot of the shots, for example, the one on the left side, were very intentionally planned in advance. There's also many shots that arose quite spontaneously from the site and from the unexpected phenomenon that the architecture creates, like the shot on the right-hand side here. I think that this was actually shot probably 2 years before the other shot on the left. And I think we were probably trying to work with the shots in the corridor. And this was probably October, I think, of 2017. But realizing that at that point in the year, it was just too late to get any natural light into that portion of the building, I turned around at kind of 180 degrees behind me, this kind of magical scene was unfolding. Like I said, it was kind of probably early fall. And at that point of the year, in kind of early morning, the sun is rising right opposite the lake, kind of on axis with the building. And so you get this magical quality of light where the sunlight is bouncing off the surface of the water and then reflecting onto the wood ceiling itself. And then inside of the cottage, reflecting also against the inner pane of the glass to create this kind of dual directionality of light bouncing around within the interior space. And that's one of my favorite shots, I think, still of the project. But if there's one thing that I take away, I think that it's, it's such a special place that was a real privilege for me to photograph, that's intimately connected to the landscape of the Canadian Shield. And it was such a privilege to shoot over the course of the changing seasons.
It's remarkable to hear the stories of how all these pieces came together, the photographs and the text and all of the components of this remarkable book. Howard, I'd like to bring you into the conversation as well. Of course, there's not only the photographs and Ken's text and sketches, but of course your own sketches and drawings that are placed throughout this book. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the different scales of design exploration that you explored at Point William.
Yes, I mean, what was interesting about this whole project is that we started in '97 working on the boathouse, and I think at that point we were looking at different. We were trying to develop a project that kind of tapped into the kind of cultural condition of Muskoka, which was had the history of all these quite refined boats and kind of mahogany boats from the 30s, but also the kind of more rustic traditions of the Muskoka. So at that point, we were kind of developed this, I would say, kind of collage project of these kind of different conditions in the boathouse, and in order to achieve some of the more refined smaller scale elements, we crafted door handles and things, and those were all kind of crafted by hand, by machinists and things. And sort of parallel, I would say, to Ed's comments about photography changing, technology has also changed in the last 20 years, and so as we moved later on the later projects, we were still interested in the kind of explorations, but the technology allowed us to do other things. So we were able to start experimenting with 3D printing, but also 3D printing in bronze and things, which was kind of a direct fabrication methodology for us, which was super interesting. So whilst the original projects were, it's a bit like the 4x5 camera and the film plates, they were all sort of traditional technology. The latter projects, we were experimenting with sort of one-off custom hardware, 3D printed, which is pretty interesting. And so the whole process of the project was it was kind of a bit like doing a painting over 20 years. I mean, we do the first project, and then there was a gap, and then we come back and do another project, and kind of referring to our own work, but maybe adding a bit more blue or a bit more red or something into the composition. And so by the time we got to the end of it, we'd kind of had this whole kind of complex language of things going on between both the landscape interventions and also the building interventions. And so the range of scales on the project were really I think super interesting for us, because it allowed us to experiment both this image we're looking at here shows both the curvature of the ceiling in the living room in parallel with the kind of handle prototypes for the cottage. So it allowed us to kind of look at kind of a language for each project, and across the whole group of projects that would be sort of somehow have relationships internally kind of built in by the kind of expression. So I think it was kind of an amazing opportunity, and we kind of just kept going, and the client was totally into it all, and so it kind of just built on itself. So it is kind of a crazy project at that level. It was a kind of a cumulative, I would say, enthusiasm on everyone's part that allowed it to kind of really become kind of exotic at some level, but also for us super interesting, and allowed us to kind of do all these experiments with different aspects, both at the level of landscape, like the big rock being exposed and the kind of plane of gravel, but also at the level of the kind of smaller fittings and furnishings and things. So I think it's kind of an amazing piece of our kind of career, actually, because it has spanned 20 years, and it really in between projects, we were working on other projects in our studio, so we kind of came in and out of this project, which I think is really, super unusual, actually. For a private client to keep kind of doing these projects, and then to allow us to kind of experiment in each one with something that related to the last one, but was a new thing in itself. So that I think that's sort of
yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Ken, I do want to circle back to you. And in a way, we've been kind of going almost to the micro, looking you were talking before about, about the particular relationship of the building to the landscape, the qualities and textures of the materials, and the kind of experiential qualities of the site. But I wondered if you'd be willing to kind of take a big zoom out, because of course, recently you've been doing all kinds of writing with the recent reedition of Modern Architecture, Critical History. You've been thinking a lot about global modernism. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit on how you would situate the work at Point William within these larger North American and even global contexts.
Well, yes. Well, I suppose the first thing to be said maybe is the issue of, the first thing that comes to mind in response to what you've just asked me is this issue about Canadian architecture, and maybe it's of course an invidious comparison, but when I think of, let's say that's convenient, the last 20 years of development in Canada versus the last 20 years in the United States, I think what has happened in Canada is, well, of course, but it's always like that. It's a certain number of people, of course, in some ways kind of make the culture, And I think what's interesting is that I think the last 20 years of work in Canada, one can really speak about a culture of architecture with exceptional architects. For one reason or another, being able to achieve works that are particularly, of their moment, but also, articulate and richly layered in terms of their cultural content, And I don't think it's so easy to find work of that caliber in the United States. So I think, of course, that's what I meant when I said this is a somewhat invidious comparison. Of course, there is this figure of Louis Kahn that stands out, of recent dates, so to speak, in American architecture. But after Kahn's demise, I'm left asking the question, well, inside, of course, to myself, and I will, of course, since I'm making it public, I will get some adverse commentary, no doubt. But I think that, what has happened in Canada is particularly vital and extremely interesting and very promising for the future also. And since you put this question in the context of this fifth edition of Modern Architecture Critical History, which came into being because the publisher wanted to, I have to credit the publisher, to expand the book to transcend the kind of transatlantic Eurocentric view of things, and to widen it out, particularly, and therefore, of course, work in India and in China and in Japan and in Australia and also in Southeast Asia. And the book also comes back to Europe to kind of reconsider things that were left out of the very first edition and until now still left out. In fact, in the fifth edition, there are some things that I was able to kind of balance out the book, so to speak. Well, I mean, the other thing that what fascinates me is that there are certain moments when a culture of architecture comes into being, I think. Like in Canada, I've just remarked, but also in Ireland, for example, recently there is a very definite sort of a discernible culture of architecture with a lot of vitality. And one doesn't know how long this wave of creativity will last. I think it has its own life, of course. And right now, China, for example, there is an incredible sort of emerging with a younger generation of Chinese architects, mostly working in the regions and not in the centers of China, doing extraordinary work. So I think there is an emerging culture of architecture there. And so, the book also tries to, in as much as it is possible to do such a thing. I mean, the book is a total presumptuous, crazy idea in a way. I mean, how can you cover such wide scope of creativity in a meaningful way? I mean, it's really a problem. This problem of the inclusion, exclusion. It's in the end, it's totally subjective. Of course, it can't be anything else. I think that's probably enough for the moment.
Well, it's interesting, Brigitte, when we were preparing for this talk, Brigitte and I were talking about how, every book has an idea and, and it needs to at its core for it to be a coherent entity. So sometimes those ideas are crazy and ambitious, and that takes us for a journey as authors. And then speaking of the ideas behind books, Brigitte, you were also mentioning that you saw Point William as kind of perhaps the first in a series of books. I'm curious what that kind of journey looks like for you, or what the other possible books in that series might be.
Are you addressing me on this?
I'll at Brigitte and Howard, if that's okay.
Okay.
No, I'm sure that they'd be interested in your ideas too, Ken.
Okay. No, I think I want to hear what the architects have in mind. Yes.
I guess we've been really fortunate to have been part of lots of different series. So on the left one is the Eames lecture from the University of Michigan. There was the next one is the Martel lecture from the University of Buffalo. And then we have a book called The Passage of Time, which is part of Documents in Canadian Architecture through Dow Press. And I guess because this project, at Point William was a 20-year journey, we actually have other projects that we've worked on for 30 years, if you can believe it, with lots of little experiments, big experiments, inside and outside. And so we actually thought that maybe if this architecture of Point William, a laboratory of living, does well, we could imagine a series of projects where in effect there is this time period and multiple experiments and different sites. One in the Toronto Ravine, one in a Russian forest, that really both captures the built form, but also transports you to a place. And you actually kind of going through the book, you actually understand a place in the global landscape that is very specific and particular through the architecture and through all of these other elements. So that's our long-term hope. And we're really just so excited to be able to launch the first of what could be a potential series.
Well, and what a treat to be able to go on a journey through the book, especially, I mean, in the pandemic, but also with, you know, with these private houses that are very difficult to visit otherwise. So I see that there's a few questions in the chat. Mason, I don't know if you want to field some of those questions, perhaps. This would be a good moment for that.
Sure, we can do that and keep the questions coming in. First of all, Brigitte, Howard, Ken, Ed, and Scott, you have a lot of fan mail in the chat, so maybe in your spare time, feel free to peruse that. But on to maybe some other more specific questions. Toby Rosenberg is asking, in what ways did landscape changes affect the project? This probably could be spoken about from both the photographic viewpoint and from the architectural point, or even from Ken's sketches. So I'll throw it out to all of you to see who would like to go first.
Brigitte and Howard, do you want to start on with that one?
You start.
So the question is, could you just repeat the question, Mason?
Sure. In what ways did landscape changes affect the project? I guess that could be interpreted over the 20-year period or over the seasonal period that I know Scott and Ed spoke about as well.
Yeah, actually, Elsa, could you put that one site plan we were looking at a moment ago back on? Yeah. So I think one of the most interesting aspects of this project was probably the biggest kind of revelation in a way is a lot of the buildings had some form of building there prior to us doing anything. So we were kind of doing both renovations as well as kind of demolition on some projects. But one of the big things was this giant rock that was between the pre-existing kind of guest house, which is currently located on the same location, and then this kind of new cottage, which there was an original kind of 60s cottage which kind of sprawled across this rock. And so by doing essentially by kind of demolishing a big part of that footprint, we exposed this rock, and it became this incredible kind of object in between these two buildings. And then by establishing this kind of, I mean, one of the clients' requirements was to be able to drive up to their cottages so they could unload the groceries and all those kind of normal things. And we didn't really want a driveway kind of, you know, coming up to the front door. So the idea was to develop this kind of dry garden, kind of Japanese gravel bed that would kind of act as a part of the landscape, but also could be driven on. And by making this kind of precise edge around this rock, both the rock and then this kind of gravel bed and the kind of meadow in the middle became these kind of three remarkable kind of spaces in the middle of the site. The big kind of meadow was basically where the septic system was, and the gravel was essentially a driveway, but it allowed us to make it into actually kind of a garden-like kind of strategy. And I think those kind of three things then kind of centered the project in a way. And and then there was a whole series of kind of incremental kind of pathways and boardwalks and things which were kind of orchestrated to develop access to the project, but also kind of develop a kind of promenade to the different projects. And so I think the rock, this kind of gravel, and the kind of meadow were the kind of three, surrounded by forest, were kind of the three kind of primary landscape strategies. And the revelation of this kind of big rock, and by putting this plane of gravel, it became this incredible object, whereas before it kind of just was kind of disappeared into the ground. So that was
actually a portion of an existing building on top.
Yeah, over top of it. Yeah.
So you actually didn't even know it was there.
Right.
So that was really the comment I made about maybe the best thing you do is actually removing things as opposed to adding things. Because in removing it, you actually reveal the rock, which it was always there, but just covered up and obscured, and they were using it really as a foundation. And so the idea that it now becomes a kind of piece of the site in a different way is sort of part of, so maybe by doing less, you're doing more. By removing things, you're actually contributing to maybe making more of a place than was actually there before.
Right.
Another question in the Q&A function at the bottom of everyone's screen. It's a question for Brigitte and Howard. Ken Frampton, in his many lyrical descriptions today, this is from Louise Hartman, by the way. Hi, Louise. Offered that he experienced the site and its structures as a, quote, stroll garden. I'm wondering if, when you were designing the buildings and landscape, you were thinking of iconic stroll gardens like Katsura Villa.
Yeah, well, I think certainly when we did the boathouse, it was more of a kind of standalone project. And I think at that point, it was really just, it was, and I think, so that was 20 years ago. And I think at that point, we actually hadn't been to the Katsura. Subsequently, we've been a number of times. And I think, so as we developed the rest of the project, I think it was probably, it was certainly, it's a completely different landscape and it's a completely different kind of world here. In this kind of more, quasi, let's call it kind of wilderness, as opposed to the Japanese, suburb of Kyoto. I think the idea of this kind of stroll garden and the relationship of the buildings to one another became more and more kind of powerful. And as we developed the landscape, it really, I think it reinforced some of those issues. And we actually, the driveway which goes out to the kind of the country road is probably a kilometer long, and even that was kind of part of this kind of journey from the road into the property, with different view kind of corridors out to the lake in certain moments, and then as you leave your car, all those things were kind of orchestrated as a part of this kind of unfolding building landscape combination. So it's for sure. I mean, you can't go to the Katsura and not be influenced by it, I think. I mean, that was sort of, certainly there's other Japanese gardens, but I think and also, places like, Stourhead and English kind of picturesque landscapes are part of our kind of experiences. And I think those all influence how you build in the landscape. Right?
Yeah.
Certainly Ken, Ed, and Scott did their own strolling around the building to sort of look for ideal vantage points from which to take it all in. So it's interesting how it sort of promotes strolling, whether there's a rock in your way or not. Another question in the Q&A is a question, I guess, also to Brigitte and Howard, about what drove the choice of interior materials that the hand and eye touch. We've spoken a lot about the landscape and the exterior and the overall organization on the site. I guess Damir Kusek is interested to hear a little bit more about the interior.
So I would say with the main building, I would say this big, huge rock on the outside, we actually wanted to pull it inside. And we actually used a Canadian granite. Not so easy to find Canadian granite. You would think in Canada would be easy, but we had to really search and hunt for it. It's actually a granite from Quebec, but it's actually part of the same geomorphological structure that this shield is on. In a way, this kind of idea of pulling the outside in and the inside out is kind of a play that we're always interested in. And in a way, some of the interior decisions are really defined by the proximity to exterior conditions.
I would say, I would add to that. I mean, I think, once going back to the boathouse again, I mean, there was a certain kind of idea about building in, a sympathetic way to the tradition there. That turned out there was a fair bit of maintenance on that project. And by the time we got to the main cottage, the clients were sort of more interested in something that had less maintenance,
more enduring,
or more let's say more durable and could weather. So the choices on the main building were really about how it would weather and transform through weathering, and sort of anticipating that. And what's been super interesting actually is the relationship with the wood cladding at the upper part and the kind of corten steel and the stone base. There's a kind of there is a kind of orchestration of weathering on it, which I think is really interesting. I mean, to kind of to not control that, but to really be sort of kind of super aware of it, and to kind of somehow channel that, I think is a really interesting possibility in buildings. So and I think and the little guest house is completely clad in weathering steel, so it has its own kind of organic quality about it.
And we actually used a lot of the pre-weathered weathering steel on the inside as well.
In the main car, yes.
So there's kind of, again, this push and pull between inside and outside.
So some of it, is kind of relationship based, and some of it's practical. I mean, some of it's just kind of saying, okay, well, how do we make a building that is has less kind of ongoing maintenance and is really durable and kind of and expresses that kind of durability and its and the qualities over time.
I think on that note, we're actually going to have to wrap this panel up. I'd like to thank everybody, Brigitte and Howard, Ken, Ed, and Scott, for being part of this panel today, but above all, for contributing this amazing work, the actual built work, and this amazing reflection in photos and in texts and in sketches on this work that allows us all to enjoy a place that many of us may never be able to visit in person. So there's a link to the Aura website that I think is going to be placed in the chat. And the publishers have generously offered a discount for those that are attending. So if you click on that link, you should be able to buy a copy at a discounted rate. So thank you again to all of our speakers. Thank you to the Daniels faculty for hosting this event. Thanks for Tim, Nini, and Aidan for your great work and supporting all the logistics behind the scene. To see or register for any of the Daniels events this year, head to the news and events page on the Daniels faculty website. And the Daniels faculty's next event, Rare Plant Communities in Ontario, is part of the Daniels lecture series. It happens tomorrow, February 10th at 12 p.m. And then the next event after that in the Daniels talk series is called Constructing a Revisionist Architectural History of the Americas, an architectural history colloquium. And it's coming up on Thursday, February 11th at 12:30 p.m. So we hope to see you online again soon, and have a great afternoon and a wonderful week.
Thank you, Elsa, for moderating. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks.
Great.